You know, one thing that always impresses me is when I hear a good self-taught story, a story about people who teach themselves how to do a certain skill and they really master it. I think those stories have always impressed me because I realize that virtually everything that I know how to do, I was taught by somebody else. For example, my granddad taught me how to whistle. He was one of those people that could do all of the different bird sounds, and you give him any tune and he could whistle it. Now, I can't do all of that. But if you ever want me to do the Andy Griffith theme song, just know that my granddad taught me how to do that. I've learned a lot of things from my dad as well, like, for example, how to wrap a Christmas present. I hear some people brag sometimes that they can wrap a Christmas present using only like 3 small pieces of tape. You may have heard people talk about that before. I think my dad and I can do better. It's a 2-step process. Step 1, buy a gift bag. Step 2, put the present in the bag. That is something I learned from my dad. But you hear stories sometimes about people who learn things and they're self-taught in their education. Like, for example, Abraham Lincoln is a famous one of the most respected thinkers of his generation. But as you may know, Abraham Lincoln spent very little time in formal education. Only about 12 months of his entire childhood and adolescence was he actually enrolled in school. He was, by and large, self-taught in his education. Another example from the same time period, Frederick Douglass spent no time in formal education because he was enslaved, but he taught himself to read and write using things that he would scavenge and find from other children, other children's work at school. He taught himself everything from the ground up and then became one of the most influential writers, most influential voices in the abolition of slavery. Those are extreme examples, but they're examples of people who, in a real way, were very much so self-taught. So what about you? Have you ever had an attempt in your life to teach yourself a skill or something that you wanted to be self-taught in? And what was that like for you? Were you able to teach yourself something like that? Or maybe we could spend some time talking in our groups about where you did learn to do some of the skills and things that you know in your life. Like, who was it who taught you to drive a stick shift? Or who was it who taught you how to cook? In life, we learn many things from many different places. So what's an example of someone who taught you something? And what's an example of when you tried to be self-taught in something as well? Let's talk about some of those things in our groups. Well, today, as we continue in our discussion of the dynamic duos of First Thessalonians, these themes that are paired together in this letter to make for a dynamic Christian life, what's interesting today is that what we're going to be talking about is not something self-taught, but rather something God-taught. That's exactly how Paul describes it in our key verse today, which is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 9. There Paul writes, "Now concerning brotherly love," meaning the love for one another in the church, "concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another." And that part near the end of that verse is really what I want to focus on here for just a moment. That phrase there, in most of our English Bibles, it's a 3-word phrase, taught by God. But when Paul writes this by God's Spirit, and he's writing this letter in Greek, what he does here is he writes a word that we have not seen anywhere else in the New Testament. In fact, in no other Greek writings of the time do we know of anybody using this word. It's as though Paul makes up a word in order to get his point across. And he does this by mashing together 2 other concepts. He calls the Thessalonians theodidactos. Theodidactos. And it comes from the first half. That word theo is a word from the word for God. Think of our word theology, which is the study of God. And then the second part, didactos, may remind us of a word we know in English, didactic, which is a word that teachers use to describe their purpose in teaching. Didactic is a word for teaching. And so Paul takes these 2 words, theodidactos, And what he's saying is, you are God taught. You are God taught. That is the kind of love that you show, the kind of love that God teaches. And that may be worth dwelling on for a moment with each other for our discussion. What is the kind of love that is God taught? What does it mean to have a God taught love in your life? And maybe the best way to talk about that is to think about it in comparison to some of the other loves that we're taught, like the kind of love that is taught in society or the kind of love that's taught in the world as it normally is. How is that different from having a God taught love? So in your groups, you just spent some time comparing the love that the world teaches to the love that God teaches. Well, that sort of comparison is something that Jesus himself has a lot to say about. Take, for example, these words from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" That's one way that people teach about love. But God taught love, Jesus says, is to love your enemy. That's what makes the love that God teaches so unique. A couple of verses down from that, Jesus elaborates further. Verse 46, "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" So notice how Jesus, in each of these questions, is contrasting the God-taught love with the love that even the Gentiles have, or the love that even the tax collectors have. He's showing the difference between those two kinds of loves. And what is it that makes God-taught love different? What makes God-taught love different is that it exceeds the expectation of what is normally taught about love. It extends beyond the typically expected behavior. It's typically expected that you would love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But God-taught love exceeds that. It's typically expected that you would love the ones who love you. But God-taught love exceeds that. It's typical to love those who are in your little circle. But God-taught love goes beyond that. And I think that that's what makes Paul's encouragement to the Thessalonians so very great. He says that this is something they're already doing. He says, you don't need anybody to teach you because you have God-taught love for one another. And that's a very good thing. But notice what the challenge is that comes after that as we continue in our verses. So he says, your love for all the believers is good. It's God-taught. But verse 10, we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. So in other words, what Paul says is, you have been learning the type of love that God teaches. That's good, but keep working at it more and more. And he says, add to that love something else. Add to it a walk of integrity. Add to it a respectable life. Add to it living in the kind of way that would have a good reputation amongst the people who are outside of your circles. He says, live a quiet life, live a respectable life. And who is that going to have an impact on? Verse 11, it's going to have an impact on outsiders, those who are not yet amongst those who believe, those who are not yet acquainted with the love that God teaches. How are they going to be persuaded to join in what you're doing? How are they going to be persuaded and able to experience God's love unless they first see in you a respectable life, a life of integrity that's decent and that is good? Without that, why would anyone who's on the outside want to be a part of what you're doing? Why would anyone want to be drawn in? So we have these two qualities that the passage brings together for us. On the one hand, there is love, the type of love that is taught by God. And on the other hand, there is integrity. There's a life that is respectable and that has a good reputation. And I do think that bringing these two qualities together in our lives does make something really, truly powerful, because it makes the impression wider. Just like with God-taught love, it's all about exceeding the expectation. How are we going to exceed the bounds of our love for one another and draw in those outside of us? Unless we live the kind of lives that would appeal to them, unless we live the kind of lives that they would respect. So I think there's something powerful going on here when we can learn to live the kinds of lives of integrity amongst outsiders that would help them to understand God's love. What about you? How do you think that these verses might apply to our lives as we try to bring together the love that God is teaching us with a respectable life amongst outsiders? Let's conclude our time together by discussing that as a group. Well, as we conclude today, let me just encourage you that in the same way that God's love, the type of love that God teaches, stands out amongst all the other kinds of loves, so also the walk of integrity that God calls us to is going to stand out as well. If we will live quiet lives and we will show respect to our neighbors and the outsiders that we come in contact with, that is going to stand out, because a life of respect and respectability is uncommon in our world today. So let's be ready to show that to people this year. This is our first Sunday of 2024, and let's make a goal of ours to try to show the kind of love that God teaches and try to live the respectable walk that God calls us to in our lives this year. And who's to say what sort of impact that could have on the people that we come in contact with?